I can hear the clock outside chiming. Where is it? Okay. So we are here this evening with Kate Fletcher, and we're very pleased to have her here this week for a couple of days of workshops. And she is going to be doing a talk just now. Kate is director of sustainability consultancy called Slow Fashion. She's also a reader in sustainable fashion at London College of Fashion. She does pioneering work in sustainable fashion, and her work is rooted in nature's principles and the culture of slow fashion. She's been exploring post-growth fashion and craft of use, and she has contributed to many books and workshops and projects, and of course her own books, The Sustainable Fashion and Textiles Design Journeys, Craft of Use, and more recently, Wild Dress. I will just hand you over to Kate now, and she will start doing her talk, and then we'll have a little bit of a Q&A afterwards. Now, I believe people can post questions, so I will look out for those. Kate.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Hello. Good evening, if it is the evening that when you're joining us. Thank you, Gillian, and to the team at Remode for inviting me. I'm really, really happy to be here and joining you for these days. These were days that were rescheduled because of COVID, and now we're working around it. And actually, it feels so good to be meeting others again, and the energy and the hope I think that we're generating is important as we're beginning to perhaps release ourselves tentatively back into the world. Thanks also to Glasgow School of Art, who is also one of the organisations that have invited me, and specifically to John Thorne, who's the Sustainability Officer at Glasgow School of Art. So my talk this evening is going to be exploring lots of things with loads of different examples. It's a bit of a tour through some of the key ideas that I think are the essential ones that we need to grapple with as we begin to really engage with a sense of change and urgent change in and around fashion. So as every good researcher should do at the outset, you should position yourself. Where is it that you're coming from? And this is me. I think I must be about 4 actually, with my older brother Scott. I have 2 other siblings too. I grew up in Liverpool in a working class family in the 70s and 80s. And my experience of growing up then was that Liverpool was a place perhaps a little like many people's experience of maybe Glasgow in Scotland, which was by the famous Margaret Thatcher and her relationship, of course, with Ronald Reagan at the time, where she famously moved the city of Liverpool into a state of managed decline. Thereby, very, very simply, with that single decision, almost deciding that the people and the city itself was not worth investing in. And the legacy of that still actually haunts me to this day. The city, if you ever visited in those years, was a pretty woeful place. It was a place that was bleak and really without hope. And at the time, I remember asking lots of questions of my grandparents and my parents as well, but my grandparents were particularly insistent that I know my place within the class system. And as a working class girl in particular, that I respect that and prop up the class system by thinking in terms which understood where I could act and what I could do. And in many senses, their challenge to me of like, know your place, Kate, has been something that I have actually been doing ever since. I've literally been trying to know my place, care for my place, cherish it. And this is the place that I mean, the earth, and all the relations that live here with us all. And this also is our place. It's a planet on the edge, our precious home, our home that is the host for all our activities, including our fashion activities. This is our place. And now let's take a step back and just think, okay, so if this is our home, let's think a little bit more about what fashion is and also its relationships between this and our earth home. So, as I'm sure you are already aware, the fashion industry itself is a complex system. And one of the things that we realise is that as many of us who've been engaging in work around sustainability and fashion, like me for pretty much 30 years now, is that we really understand that there's lots of different ways that you can go about trying to foster change. And the visionary systems thinker, Donella Meadows, right back in the 1990s, drew up this list, which she described as places that you can intervene in a system to affect change. And what Donella Meadows did is she organised this list, starting at the top, where the place where people most often start to affect change. And she ordered it like this, with the numbers 9 to 1 going down the list, because she said, actually, the place that people most often start, which is tinkering with efficiencies, substituting one material for another, those sorts of activities, they are the least effective places to bring about change. And this is one of the most startling things. We put most of our effort into the areas within the fashion system that are going to deliver the least benefit. And so actually what we need to do instead, if we're going to think about the fashion system as a complex system and how to affect change there, we need to start actually not with number 9, efficiencies and materials, number 8, but we need to go down to the mindset, the purpose of the fashion system itself, or begin to reevaluate what the goals are and the rules of the fashion system. So one of the things we're going to do this evening is explore some of these, what these might mean, and how we can begin to affect change. But affecting change is really hard. And there are many ways to do it. And I remember once looking at the book of a wonderful American poet called Gary Snyder. And he suggested, you know, when change is hard and you don't quite know where to begin, he recommended that we do 2 things. The first of which is to really teach yourself, inform yourself about where we are currently. So we have to build deep knowledge of the current conditions. And then the second thing he suggested, once you've understood where you are, then you need to take a risk. Then you need to stray outside of the understanding that you have and begin to explore things in new and different ways. Okay, so we're going to go on a journey exploring these 2 things now. So, number 1, this is build awareness of where you are. So where are we? Fashion, as I'm sure you already know, is an engine of consumerism, and the language and the expression of the consumer society in the clothes that we buy is so overriding, it's so dominant, that actually, quite frankly, we hardly even notice it. It's frequently like normal to access and engage with fashion primarily by exchanging money for products, for new stuff. It's expected that these same pieces will look outdated in 6 months, maybe less. And it's usual to discard rather than repair. In fact, so much so that ideas of progress have become really tied to a societal narrative of growth through buying more garments. Growth has become seen as essential in order to maintain the stability of the economy, and the social language of position and status is really woven into what we buy in a clothing form. And the different approaches to production and manufacture that we have in the fashion system today have actually been shaped to suit the demands of consumerism itself. What we see is that cheap garments, which so dominate people's experience of fashion today, have totally changed. They've impacted and changed consumption patterns. In the first decade of the 21st century, for instance, the price of clothing in Europe fell by more than 25%. And in the US, I think it was by something like 18%. And in that same period, people increased the quantity that they bought by pretty much the same amount, by about 20% more. Also, in that sense, how long the products that are produced and sold and marketed last for is completely determined by the market's need to continuously grow, to show positive returns on the bottom line. In fact, we're in a sort of a strange situation where there's an ideological and almost a technological convergence where the political ideology of shopping as a democratic choice is woven tightly together with the sorts of technologies that we have available. And what we see is that shopping has become almost a political project that integrates economic and personal freedoms. This all dictates the nature of dressing. We buy low cost clothes and we buy them in bulk. The fashion industry measures its success in retail sales figures, and then this goes on to shape how we dress. Businesses fit into the market to provide for this. Classic in Liverpool, of course, the sportswear. And then what we see is that then the businesses that are filling in the market frame all the solutions in its own terms. All of the solutions look like more product to buy. So we get sort of stuck in this trap. And the dominant model that we're engaging with at the moment assumes the preference for consumer fashion. The preference given to fashion as shopping ensures that the market becomes like a structural necessity. You see, we're dug in really deep here into a situation which actually feels beyond our control. But this same thinking of fashion as shopping even affects the sort of sustainability solutions that are offered. These tend, of course, to be ready-made clothes that we go forward and just buy. In its current form, fashion design does very little to cultivate agency and capabilities among people who wear clothes. Instead, it tends towards undermining the self-esteem of users, and the system itself relies on a production addiction linked to shopping for new pieces. All of this, that whistle-stop tour, leads us to a point which everybody, I'm sure, is already familiar with, but perhaps it's worth restating, is that fashion really does contribute to the crisis of, perhaps you would call it, unsustainability. And I don't want to suggest that in no way that people haven't been making efforts, because for more than 30 years, there have been vast efforts put in to reduce the negative effects. In fact, so early 1990s, the impact of the fashion sector on society was really realized, and efficiencies began to be pursued. New fibers were developed, new chemical processes, technical improvements in terms of water, in energy efficiency, supply chain initiatives, transparency, recycling, upcycling. And this, importantly, I would say, has led to a situation where we're in a happy position that if you looked at each individual garment separately, isolated on its own, we would probably say that the impact associated with that garment is less today than it was 30 years ago. So this is a sort of a good news story in that regard. And yet there is a drawback. It's that that individual garment may be improved, but the entire system that individual garment sits within is actually doing something else. It's growing, and it's growing very fast. And the system itself actually is optimized for growth. And what we have begun to see is that the efficiency gains that are delivered with our best efforts, they don't mean much when you have a system that's growing year on year. At best, what we see is that things get worse more slowly. And at the moment, the net impact of the sector is still increasing. This is a difficult message, of course, because we've been trying our best and it's sort of missing the point. And maybe one of the things that we realise is that our current approaches haven't been working, perhaps because they've all been a bit too similar to each other. They're too simple sometimes, maybe they're a bit neat, maybe they don't really reflect the complexity of the situation that we're facing. Frequently, the sorts of things that are being prescribed aren't human scale, and they also don't recognise the interconnected forces that influence the whole system. They don't recognise the fact that the big picture is influenced by the cumulative story of all our purchases, not what each individual garment means alone. And this is really important. Gillian, just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, because I think there's an issue with the mute.
I can hear you again now. Okay.
Okay, thanks. So this piece of research identified these 9 planetary boundaries, and 3 of them have already been transgressed. Oops. The first of which is, of course, well, I think I'm going to go on to talk about those. So what we understand because of this pressure on planetary boundaries, that we actually have to begin to think really differently about fashion and sustainability. And we have to not just ask questions about what we're dressing in, materials questions, or perhaps questions about the fashion manufacturing chain, but we also have to ask about how we are dressing. We have to begin to really focus on and deal with the bigger question about fashion culture. What we know, and this is evidenced by massive amounts of research into well-being and also psychological effects of consumption. What we know is that having more stuff, doesn't equate to an increase in well-being when it's beyond basic needs have been met. And in fact, actually, while affluence has delivered important improvements in levels of happiness, that when we have sufficient food, shelter and clothing, more wealth doesn't deliver any substantial greater benefits. What we realise is more modest affluence would have sufficed. And this is a really challenging idea, because we go on to begin to see it's that having more stuff doesn't necessarily equate to increases in well-being, but actually more than that, a materialistic attitude that's frequently associated with buying more actually undermines our well-being. It's been shown that it has very close links with high levels of antidepressant use, and the more materialistic attitudes that one has, the fewer friends. And so it appears that we are in maybe what you would call a social trap, where material consumption is pushed forward, including by those who are marketing fashion to us. So material consumption is pushed forward as a key indicator of status and well-being, yet that same consumption damages us. Perhaps what all this goes on to point to is that the issues that we're dealing with here are not a technical challenge. In fact, many people actually think that we have many of the technological solutions that we need already to deal with some of the sustainability questions. But actually what we're dealing with here is a political challenge, and we need to begin to approach the questions around fashion and sustainability differently. So while we have the technologies to transform our economy, we don't have the skills. And perhaps one of the things that we've forgotten is that sustainability ultimately is a movement that's concerned with others. And that's perhaps where we need to start from. Okay, so thinking back, Gary Snyder's advice was, first of all, to find out where you are. And so we dug a little into that. And the second piece of advice was to stray, to take a risk, to step off the path and begin to explore things in new ways. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to explore some other ways of thinking about sustainability, other practices, other vocabulary, other visions, other visual identities. And I suppose what I'm going to tell you is something that's very different to the usual story that people tell around fashion and sustainability. And it starts with a project that I did for 5 years, starting in 2008, which was called, both two names actually, rather confusingly, but ultimately the work ended up as a book called The Craft of Use, but it's a vast actually repository of work. And this work started from a very simple idea. It was a sort of a what if question, actually. What if we gave as much attention to tending, to maintaining, to wearing garments, as much attention to those things as to creating them in the first place? What if we prized usership as much as we do ownership? What would happen if we did those things? What would happen to us and to everything else? The reasons why this feels important is because we do know that we cannot continue to grow the fashion sector, and we have to begin to look for the opportunities for fashion provision, for fashion expression that sit in a space beyond consumerism. And what the Craft of Use does is it represents possibilities and practicalities for fashion, mainly within the clothing that we already have. What we see is that use of clothes is not dependent on producing and consuming more. Rather, it takes its bearings instead from the skills, from practices, from the ideas of tending and wearing in the context of real lives. It's not that using garments doesn't use any resources, of course it does, but rather it's not driven by the politics, by the economics of growth. And this is the really critical thing. Where is its driver? It's from a sense of satisfaction and usefulness in people's lives, not from growth economics. What we see is that a lot of extraordinarily valuable activity happens outside the formal economy, the normal terms of reference of the market. And we see that many examples of different sorts of fashion activity already exist, and also that many of the things that we need to make happen, they don't contribute to the bottom line. They're in a different space altogether. So the practice of the Craft of Use, this whole event, this whole project, the way that I went about it is it ended up as almost 500 stories that were recorded of the public telling me how they use the products, the goods, the clothing that they already have. And I set up a simple photo shoot in different communities. I think it ultimately ended up as 13 different countries in 3 continents. And I invited people to come along. I put ads in newsagents' windows, on community notice boards. I spoke on local radio. We used social media, and then just waited to see what turned up. And we were inundated in different places. So this, for example, is Mr. Edwards. This is where I live in the north of England, just outside Macclesfield. He turned up with what he described as his 3-stage jacket. It was apparently originally a very slim fitting waistcoat. You can just see the edge of it here. And when he put some weight on and couldn't fasten it up the front anymore, he took a pair of scissors and slit it up the back, and then knitted this panel and inserted it into the back section. And then he decided he carried on wearing it for a while, and then he decided, oh, you know what this needs is some sleeves and a collar and a waistband. And so he added these to the jacket. And then he said, over a period of years, he put on some more weight and couldn't fasten it up the front anymore. So then he added leatherette latchets, as he described them, these small pieces of leatherette fabric across the front as a way to hold the jacket closed, and finished each one with a sequin. What's remarkable about his story is it shows the potential and the possibility of how a life of action can unfold in the space of garments. It talks about resourceful possibility and what we can do. He wasn't a tailor, he was an engineer, but reckoned that he could act and had these sorts of skills. This garment was brought along to a photo shoot in London, and it was an old jumper that this guy said he'd had for like 20 years. He said, you know, I just didn't buy it from an ethical store, but I feel like I've had it so long that I've actually changed the values of this jumper. It wasn't an ethical brand, but actively I've made their piece into an ethical piece because I've chosen to keep on wearing it. He saw his actions as a political intervention. He didn't need a sewing kit and needle and thread to make this intervention, but he saw things differently, and that's a remarkable change. This dress was also brought in London. Jean here in her 80s brought it along. She'd been given it in the 60s when she and her family went on holiday to Antibes in the south of France. Her neighbour gave her this polka dot dress. And these are her 3 daughters and 2 granddaughters who all wear the dress. It's seen as a dress that people wear at family parties, and everyone's on the phone. Who's got the dress? We want the dress. And this becomes this incredible piece which links the stories of a family. And okay, it doesn't save resources unless the shared garment itself stops a new purchase being made. But perhaps it shows what can be done with clothing, where we perhaps move it out of the space of purely shopping for new pieces. Maybe one of the things we begin to realise is that garments themselves, all of the clothing, the fashion sector is well influenced by forces that are far beyond the control of design and production. Yet rarely do these get discussed. But it's true that sustainability themes themselves are so shaped by these forces that are beyond design and production, by the space of people's lives, that we really need to begin to work with this space rather than perhaps ignoring it. Also, maybe what we realise is that sustainability in fashion is not dictated by the intrinsic physical properties of garments, but largely by a social system. And this links back to the point before about it being a political and not a technical challenge. maybe so as we move forward, we begin to see that our challenges are different to the ones that we thought that they were. We have to begin to imagine, how can we make fashion something that's a shared enterprise between people? Can we create a social world that becomes the center of sustainability innovation in fashion? We're going to have to start from a different point of view that begins to acknowledge the contribution of others, including the people who wear clothing, in beginning to figure out what it means to intervene in this system. Can we reference use and users and do that in a way that begins to be acknowledged and really begins to change and perhaps influence the shape of design? I suppose, and these, by the way, are all images from this research project. What we have to begin to do is see what are the ways that we can transform things that aren't just around the specification of a particular fibre type, or where or how a seam is stitched. Instead, I think the challenge is that we have to engage with the processes of consumption. We have to sit with it and reckon with it as part of the process of design. What we know is that working in this way is really difficult. It's actually, it challenges the status quo quite profoundly, because what we're trying to suggest that those who create clothes do is do something entirely different instead, which is to tap into the very messy, the complex, the unpredictable lives of others. And you use these lives as a resource to learn how to live more comfortably with the imprecision of our understanding of ours and others' behaviour, which I suppose we have to begin to show the potential to influence the sustainability of the garment and the systems that create it. Suppose what we're trying to do is to bring together use with industry and meet together also public good and private interest. And these are the really interesting big challenges that are beginning to emerge. What we need to do is to recognise the actual conditions that are there and design with them. This perhaps is a way to start, is we start thinking through what are the practices that we want to innovate within, what do we want to cultivate, what do we want to enhance and grow, and to do that in a way that also reduces the demand for materials. We need to do that because we know that our system cannot continue growing indefinitely. Indefinite growth on a finite planet is impossible. Perhaps one of the things that this work, talking to almost 500 members of the public about what they do with their clothes, made me realise is that the idea of what fashion is really is much bigger than many people are taught, or perhaps many people think. It's definitely much bigger than shopping. It definitely sits in places outside of the market and economics. It's in a sense of the commons, it's in households, it's in multiple other spaces too. So we have to enlarge in our sense of what fashion is and also where we can act. And this very fundamentally is quite a big shift. It's a shift away from things, not saying that these are not important, they are, but it's supplementing that with ideas, with stories, with actions and skills, which ultimately is not abandoning what we know in the fashion space. It's not saying that design intelligence isn't important, but it's exercising it more broadly, really where it begins to meet the world. I feel like I should have said this before, but I'm going to state it again, is that sustainability cannot be defined in functional terms. It's not that sort of thing. It's a movement that's concerned with others. And that's one of the things that I think has been missing with so many of the projects that go on around fashion and sustainability, is that this has not been the fundamental acknowledged starting point. So garments, they're sold to us as products, and yet when they enter our lives, they become an ongoing, unfolding process. This is actually my dad in the 1960s on holiday on the Isle of Skye, and that he's wearing is a jumper that he's continuously worn for more than 50 years. I suppose the reason I include this beautiful shot is that a more integrated picture of what fashion is requires that we open up to the life world of the user. And what consumerism tends to do is it promotes a view of us as autonomous individuals that are not really in the ethical, social world. But that's not true. Lives happen here. Lives happen in garments like this. My life has happened entirely within the duration of this garment, for instance. So one of the things that unfolded from this project, The Craft of Use, is a whole slew of different design projects that were using what we'd begun to understand about what's important in use as the starting point for new design activity. And I suppose if we're going to engage with sustainability in fashion, then lives are a really good starting point. What we have to do is to embrace, not retreat from this very complex, wonderful world. And we have to combine data. We have to use knowledge of society and use together with industrial knowledge. Our task, I suppose, is to understand and draw out the implications of lived experience of fashion for the fashion system. At the heart of many of these processes is a bit of a conflict, and in fact, actually in fashion itself, is a conflict between the long and the short run. Many of us feel enticed to buy a new piece for that moment of me now, but we're enticed to buy it, but actually there's a sense of our responsibility to the longer term. So care for others over time maybe draws our attention into the longer term, maybe a care for resources and resourceful living. But there is a conflict when we try to balance these needs. And an economic historian, Avner Offer, suggested that perhaps what we need to do is to think about these as commitment strategies to balance the need for immediate reward, the me now sort of feeling, with our long-term interests, with long-term security. How do we do that? So he said that in the past, we've used things like prudence and self-control and willpower as a way to regulate how much shopping we do and how much we buy. And of course, these things are like, I mean, I say them prudence, you think, oh my gosh, that's not going to work anymore against social media to try to dial down the temperature of that. But actually what he said is that every era has its own commitment strategies that need to evolve in keeping with the sorts of challenges that we face. And actually commitment strategies themselves, they take time and training and a process of social learning and education to develop them. So while prudence is completely outmoded, unuseful in this moment, what we need are different commitment strategies today, different commitment strategies that help us recognize that actually we need to make different decisions in the short term in order to hold and sustain our long-term security and well-being. I would say certainly that focusing on use and the craft of use and practices of using things is one way certainly to begin to balance the needs of the present and of the future more. And if we're going to think in these terms, what we have to begin to do is to recognize the sort of satisfaction that we search for, maybe when we're buying garments, but actually increasingly we see that much of those same feelings of satisfaction can be gained from attentive and sustained use of the things that we already have. I'm now going to paraphrase from the Nobel Prize winning economist Amartya Sen, who said something, and now I'm paraphrasing it in garment terms, but just because you own it doesn't mean you know how to use it. And we have to begin to recognize that having stuff or having access to stuff is not the same as having the skills that we need to be capable and engaged and dynamic users of fashion. So that's one set of stories about how to change, but there are many others. So, as I mentioned earlier, we're in a situation where 3 of the planetary boundaries as identified by the Stockholm Resilience Centre have been transgressed. The 3 are the rates of human interference in nitrogen cycles, climate change, no surprise there. And the third is rate of biodiversity loss. And in fact, picking on this last one now, what we see, data suggests that we're on the verge of a 6th mass extinction. And since 1970, all living systems are in decline, and we have had a reduction of 58% of animal species in the last 50 years. One of the things I think that is there are many things that are very challenging about this. I mean, it is like the information I shared with you earlier. It's a very difficult thing to sit with, this recognition that as almost a 60% reduction in biodiversity has occurred in just 50 years of life. But perhaps when we begin to lift the lid on these questions to do with biodiversity and nature, is that maybe what we've begun to realise is that we're estranged from natural systems, and that we don't really see a connection between ecological systems and nature in daily life. And actually, there's a sense that we don't see this decline firsthand. Maybe if we know about it, we've just been like watching the TV, maybe we've been watching David Attenborough tell us about various things, but we don't see it and experience it firsthand. And in fact, a separation and disconnect is one of the things that is maybe the guiding principles that has really developed within late capitalism, and it has dramatic effects. So these are just 2 examples from 2019, but we could have picked any from this year, from last year. And I picked these 2 specifically because in the very same week, there was a polar vortex that led to temperatures of -40 below in Chicago and +40 in Australia. And what we see is that, so we've sort of separated and disconnected from many of the forces that are affecting our world, and yet these things are happening all around us. And then report after report begins to introduce some of the most startling information that we can see. We're facing almost what's been called insect Armageddon, where plummeting numbers of insects begin to threaten the collapse of nature because, of course, the role that insects play in the nested ecosystems is really a very large one. And so this is seen as one of the things that we're beginning to jeopardize, the building blocks of life. But when we take perhaps a step back and we think about, okay, so what is happening here? And I think many environmental philosophers, they would say that underpinning all of these issues, these themes that we're talking about, is a sense of perhaps a human-centeredness where humans are placing themselves and their interests at the core, and also a set of philosophies throughout Western modernism, which has now left us in a situation where nature, natural systems, and the support it gives to human lives is seen as detached from human experience totally. So nature is seen as remote, distanced, unknown. There's a prevalence of disassociating tendencies which distance humans from nature. And this is about a separation from context, where an action, a thing, maybe a garment, for instance, is understood independently from its surroundings. And what seeing it in that way happens is that you completely overlook the relationships. You establish a world that's full of disconnections rather than connections. And you distance yourself from the consequences of your actions and of your choices. And I think it's also been shown that the more distant that you are from something, the more willing you are to inflict harm. And so we have to turn this on its head. We have to get close so that we begin to care. We begin to take things differently. And this is important because up to this point, we've seen that humans perceive themselves within Western modernism, within the philosophy that's very much inscribed in recent Western thought from the last 400 years. Humans see themselves as a sphere apart or outside and above ecology. They see thought and the mind to be superior in a hierarchy above the body and natural systems. And this separation is perhaps at the root of all of our problems. Situated in a position where a self-enclosed outlook, where humans are at the center, fails to take account of other than human species, fails to take account of the everybody else. In this viewpoint, nature is viewed just as a resource, as a means to an end. It's not seen as creative or agential, but it's actually a source of interchangeable and replaceable units or resources. Not only that, nature is represented only ever in terms of human needs. What do humans need from the world in which we live? And biodiversity is shown as having no inherent value. It's valuable only in what it enables us humans to do. Not only that, but wildness is associated with everything that isn't human, pretty much. Or if it is associated with human, it's seen as things that are not positive, perhaps. But we are, of course, part of nature. And we have to move away from these abstractions and these notions of us as separate and instead move towards direct experience. We have to begin to understand that valid and proper knowledge comes from the context in which it occurs. And when we keep things in context, when we see the relationship between our choices and the world in which we live, it's the basis for entirely different decisions. What we're trying to do is to, in a way, effect an explosion of fashion out towards reality. So Earth is, of course, the stuff out of which we are made. It's the stuff which the fashion sector is also profoundly dependent on. And I think it's really time that we acknowledge our deep interdependence. We need to evolve a new approach to fashion and sustainability that continuously looks, that seeks out associations and that seeks to hold everything in context, that folds garment and place and life one over the other continuously, holding them in an interrelated way. We're trying to do this in order to hold things close, to take account of the everything else, and to do this repeatedly on an ongoing fashion. I really feel very strongly that what we have to do is to give a larger share. We have to give more weight, more awareness to the non-human world and the sorts of decisions we make around clothes. How and why do we need to do this? Well, how perhaps we could begin to ecologize the fashion system. Ecology, of course, is the study of relationships between things and their surroundings. And so perhaps we can foster an understanding of fashion relationally, about the relationships and interactions between garments, industry, wearers, and place. Such a move grows our interest and makes it much larger and takes into account a much bigger, less human community. And why should we do this? Well, we have to do this to protect us all, because human-centeredness is really not in the interests of humans or anybody else. So reflecting some of these practices, I made actually a small pocket guide to fashion ecology, which is free to download at the Fashion Ecology's website. I suppose its starting point is the idea that everything happens somewhere, and you have to begin to deal with these interactions and relationships and really think about the role of place. And I suppose I started with these words, playing with ecological definitions and really infusing what they might mean for fashion. We also need, I think, to evolve a new understanding of fashion that really sees it within the context of ecology and also the limits, natural limits, because this is important. Perhaps this is one way that we can begin to grow our ecological identities. And we see nature both as the enabler of dress, the enabler of the fashion system, but actually also, and this is the critical thing, we also have to see it as the limiting factor. There has to be almost a decision that we have to make not to burst through limits. We have to begin to hold our activity within what the planetary boundaries people called the safe operating space for humanity. So, some of our challenges going forward, we have to try to adopt a practice of caring beyond the home group of people, beyond the home group of humans. We have to extend to non-human species. But how do we begin to do that? These are some of the key questions that are beginning to emerge. We have to think about ways that we can design to enhance our embeddedness, human embeddedness in nature. How can we, for instance, design in a way that prioritizes relationships? What are some alternative models of caring? And how can we design while acknowledging uncertainty and the limits of human knowledge? What I think we're moving towards here is a sense of something more of a mutualistic design approach, where we reinforce our experience of nature as the context for our fashion lives. And maybe we can think about what are the ways in which we can dress for active guardianship of nature, thinking together and working and acting together in the real world. How can we open up to unpredictability, which happens all the time in natural systems? How can we open up to surprise or awe? And how can we not try to predict the outcome? Maybe the sense of what we need to do is to begin to think about a new resonance with the world that clothing begins to enable. Is this some sort of mechanism that allows us to touch the world in new and different ways? Can we show humans not outside nature, nor above an ecological fate which has overtaken under other species? But actually, maybe what we have to do is we have to reanimate the world, and we remake ourselves as we do so, and we see ourselves as enriched and active and constrained members of our incredible ecological community. So some of the San Bushman tribe of Southern Africa have described their process of understanding their ecological literacy in this way, and I'm going to quote now. This is one of them speaking. If I see a small bird but don't recognize it, there is no thin thread. But every time I see and recognize the bird, the thread strengthens. Eventually, it will grow into a string, and then a cord, and finally a rope. And I suppose what the Sand Bushman is saying is that we can make ropes that connect us with all of nature if we follow this practice, if we go out and see things and are prepared to turn up and repeatedly turn up over and over again. We have to strengthen this thread. This is obviously demanding in terms of time, in terms of attention, and it really implies return, a showing up on our part as the one who wants to strengthen this thread. So if this becomes our fashion practice, it's a very different sort of fashion practice than the ones that were sold to in the shops. But I think this is the sort of fashion practice that is required. So this new relationship that we're going to have with the world in which we live, that maybe fashion can begin to facilitate. What will it be characterized by? I think a greater humility on our part, a really strong role for direct experience where we use our own finite experience of our lives and bring that to bear as we begin to think about what dress means and how we can affect change. There's also a really active role for us in there. This is not something that you sit back and click in a sort of consuming, passive sort of way, but this is about stepping forward and fostering change. It's also a loosening of the control that humans have over the sorts of things that we're doing. It's a sense of opening up to what might happen when we take a different approach. There's also a presumption of a special power. We're important as humans, but we're not at the center, not at the sole center of this. Because actually there are multiple centers of striving, of life happening all over the place. And this leads to a real sense of change responsibility for how we act. As you may know, I'm trying to think of what slide was there, but as you may know, I have done quite a lot of nature writing recently, where I suppose it's a new hybrid form of nature writing where clothes and nature are explored together. In fact, clothes become this way in to a new sort of natural understanding. And I have found it to be, quite frankly, one of the most remarkable unfoldings of something that I didn't even know that I had in me, as I have begun to explore what it means to talk about clothes embedded in landscape, embedded in natural relationships, and really linked to the physical movement of the body, of what it means to live a different sort of life. And perhaps what I've really seen by working in this way, by approaching this sense of what does it mean to be really embedded, and my understanding of what it is to be embedded as someone working in fashion and sustainability in the natural world, I've begun to see that I must take action. Anyway, so I have written in the book Wild Dress a lot about these through autobiographical writing, and in fact there's going to be a new collection out over the next few months. Okay, I have spoken a lot, but I would say just as I close that much of this work that goes on, perhaps writing or talking from direct experience, we don't tell people these things because our lives are interesting. My life certainly is absolutely no more interesting than anyone else's, and I don't think that for the moment. But the main thing, I suppose, is that the stories of our lives, if they were only our own stories, they wouldn't be worth telling. But what all of the stories that I've told you tonight are, they collectively, they become an ethos for our times. they expose our interdependence and our interrelatedness, and the necessity is going forward of sustaining those relationships. Because, of course, our fate and our hope lies deep in the reality of our world, and that has to be our starting point. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was an incredible tour of your lines of thought, and lots of projects and some very lovely imagery there as well. I'll just say that Craft of Use, I think, is a book that's particularly connectable to, because it has a lot of, it illustrates a lot of those very personal stories and connections to individual garments. And that's, yeah, it's a lovely book to kind of flip through and for ideas. And also just to see how other people have looked at some of these issues with their clothing and making clothes last. Now, let's see, got a few questions here. So, well, first of all, I guess we've got a few things coming up there, but I wanted to just talk first of all about the fact that today, when we worked together, we talked about reconnecting politicians to reality, and the difficulty of doing that, and what might be involved, what might that look like to actually reconnect a politician to the reality of bullet dodging and life in a real situation. And I think, you know, you've talked yourself about this disconnect from nature, and we know this is hugely problematic, not just in clothing, but in food and in lots of areas. You know, people feel disconnected from the idea of economics and what that's about, and it's too complicated to understand. So how do we close that gap and make sure people feel less remote? What's the reality of closing that gap in terms of ordinary, very ordinary people getting involved in that potential social transformation and social change that I think we're underneath all this we're talking about?
So I do think that frequently when you talk about systems change, it seems like something that other people have to do. That it's something when you say, "Oh yes, you know, we need to deal with the whole system." It feels like, "Oh well, yeah, that mustn't be for me." But actually, the reality of it is that we are absolutely, all of us, whoever we are definitely the best people to affect this, because we can all affect this sort of change. And maybe one of the things that working through finite direct experience and reckoning that actually we've all got something to contribute from our particular lives and experiences, this is one of the most empowering starting points. So I have to say that I had never written creatively at all. I've written academically, absolutely, because I was sort of trained in that. And then I suppose I was hiding behind my academic training. And then suddenly I thought, my gosh, have I got something to say that is from my life experience rather than from my, maybe my academic training or my book learning? And then I realized that absolutely I did. And I just can't reiterate that. It's not that I think that I've got something special to say. It's that actually, it's that the stories that I'm telling are ones that everybody can relate to. And there's a sense of people beginning to emerge through that. So we need to collectively find ways to do that. And roots into fostering social change, they're rooted in all of our lives. That said, I don't want people to not include understanding that they've got to put pressure on the bigger brands, because absolutely we need to do that. I don't want to individualize responsibility for climate change, because actually that would be us playing in to the neoliberal model of individualizing everything. It's not that. To people of all levels and types need to take responsibility. But perhaps the point about systems thinking is that we need to make sure that we start in the right place. I'm going to tell you an anecdote now of something that I read in a fabulous book about small change. And this book was describing the work that a development practitioner was doing in a slum in the south of a Southern American country. Forgive me, I can't actually remember which one it is now, but he was working in a slum, and he spent some time in the slum sort of looking about what needed to happen, making some ideas for fostering change there. And he had lots of people pressuring him to make a decision. What do we need to do for this community? Because they're so impoverished. And he made a single suggestion. And his suggestion was to relocate a bus stop from where it was currently on the outer edges of this slum, right into the center of the slum. So they moved the bus stop. And this one tiny intervention that is within the reach of most of us to physically organize for that to happen completely changed things, because suddenly what happened is that, okay, so the bus came into the center rather than at the outside, and the slum was where the local fishermen all lived, and so word got out that you could get the freshest fish but if you went to the slum rather than waiting for it to come to you. So suddenly people from the city or the maids were now coming on the bus into the slum to buy the fish. And then some of the local lads saw this and thinking, oh, okay, we'll set up a fruit and veg stall next to the bus stop. So that emerged. And then some local people thought, oh, we'll have a bicycle delivery service. So they had a bicycle repair shop to fix the bicycles. And then the next minute there was a barber's. And so suddenly this small change resulted in this massive effect. And I suppose that's our challenge. We have to find the bus stop in our own lives and work in order to have this cascading effect. And what that is, I mean, that's for us to explore.
I think that example you're talking about is was part of the transition towns movement, and the example was possibly in a book by Rob Hopkins from what?
No, it's Nabil Handy's book called Small Change.
Oh, okay. But this is another book that looks at those very particular localized examples of making small changes because somebody local realizes that's where the issue is, but they're not in a position to pass that on to somebody who's a politician who will then go through all the rigmaroles and the so on and so forth in order to affect the change. But that's a particularly good book full of lots of examples of the realization of that way of thinking. Now, somebody in one of the boxes has talked about mass production, and if you had any thoughts on some of the ideas that you've talked about, how they can put into mass production, what that might look like in parts of the world where most clothing's produced, and what that might mean for people employed in those industries with terrible paying conditions. I mean, obviously, we're facing huge industries. This kind of social transformation we're talking about isn't going to get large corporations enthusiastically jumping in unless they can see a way of, building their own story. So
certainly, what we see is that if we're serious about dealing with ideas around growth and transforming the logic of economic growth, that is the chief impediment to fostering deep and lasting change. If we're serious about doing that, there are inevitable implications throughout the manufacturing sector and for workers. And these are no one really knows what the answers are at the moment, but at the moment, I mean, H&M as an example, they very cynically said, we can't make any changes because it will affect these lives of workers, without, of course, thinking through the implications. If you're not going to make any changes, the sea level rise would be so high in Bangladesh that those workers won't even have a home, let alone a job. So the implications are very complicated. What we see in other sectors is that as a shift happens, for example, in the energy sector, as a shift has happened towards renewables away from the carbon-based energy generation facilities, is we've seen actually an increase in jobs that have been created. I'm not saying, excuse me, I'm not saying that this will inevitably happen in the clothing manufacturing supply chain, which is a very different sort of supply chain, but there will be different sorts of employment that are created. We think that they'll probably, when we talk about less and a restriction of consumption in the global north, that doesn't of course mean less for everybody, because some people still need basic needs to be met. And so actually at the moment, what is projected is that the supply chains within, that are the supply chains that are currently supplying the global north will begin to supply different regions of the world. I mean, this is, these are moving parts and nobody really has a close view, but what we know is that some of these difficult decisions need to be discussed. Also, what we know is off the record, all of the big brands are interested in this. They recognize that we need to disassociate profit from throughput of goods. So we need to find a way to make money without the churn. And inevitably, that means something for the supply chain, whether we do it as part of a radical sustainability agenda or simply just because the brands are moving in that direction. So I think what we're on the cusp of something interesting, and I think we're seeing, you know, brands deciding, oh, we're not going to have X number of catwalk shows anymore, we're going to reduce that down, and people are beginning to experiment. Maybe COVID has increased that to a certain extent. I think it's a moment where maybe things are going to be able to tip one way a little faster, but in other ways COVID is a mixed bag, but that's a different question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, I think of some of the communities around where Remode is based in Paisley. Many of those communities have for years, for decades, been swapping clothes, mending clothes, and passing them down, doing all those things, running menages where the value of getting a piece of clothing is increased because you're saving up for it together as a collective. In a way that all those ideas are there, and I think that innovation is there, but it doesn't tend, that way, innovative way of thinking doesn't tend to be apparent in politics and politicians. And it would be great to to connect that body of people to ones that are much more localized. Another point I was going to think, well, I'm going to come to lockdown because obviously it's a huge, I think it does provide possibly a little aperture through which we can see things. We could have seen things a different way. But one of the things that when you talked about clothing a lot, it struck me that you were talking about our relationship with buying clothes as being as an addiction, as some people would talk about an addiction to fast food or sugar or drugs. And do you think that there will ever come a time when when this addiction to overconsumption is generally viewed this way, as being something that's corrosive, not just for us as individuals, but for the whole of society?
Oh, what a good. So I think we can see with cigarette addiction, nicotine addiction, is that it took a very long time. I mean, there was a massive suppression of data and research. And then, you know, the smoking ban ultimately came. I mean, it was like almost like a convergence actually of lots of different things. So health data, and then a sense of maybe interest in like health in terms of like body consciousness and lifestyles, and then lots of things just happened to come together at that one moment. And there was resistance, was there not, for a bit, and then it sort of fell away a bit. Maybe it's coming back. I mean, I know it's sort of been replaced a bit by vaping now, but I think it seems it's dropped off. I mean, since when I was young, I mean, I knew like so many people who smoked, and now it's almost, you know, it's like you put them in one hand probably, people I know. So that came about from all of these things. So will it be the same? Well, at the moment what we see is that if you call it health data around the psychological effect of having a materialistic outlook, is that it is extremely negative in terms of, as I mentioned in the talk, in terms of antidepressant use is much higher in people with a materialistic outlook. And also those people also have far fewer social connections, so far fewer friends and a smaller reliable network for support. So that bodes really badly, even for people's mental health, and let alone the environmental cost of all that increased consumption. And at the moment, it's not in any brand's interests to not push more stuff, but then it was the same for the cigarette industry. So, I mean, will it change? I mean, I suppose we think it will. And just to loop back to your other point about you saying, you know, in Paisley, these sorts of things, these hand-me-downs have been happening for a long time. And absolutely. And my sort of slight frustration with the terminology of like the circular economy is that what we're describing by hand-me-downs from, you know, my cousins, I used to wear my brother's clothes all the time, is that that's the original circular economy. You know, the original sharing economy is we've all shared bedrooms, you know, we all shared everything, you know, because that was the nature of life. And what my concern is that pairing sharing or hand-me-downs circular with the word economy moves it into a market space where then it's driven by entirely different values, and then some of its dynamics are stripped away. So there is a moral philosopher called Michael Sandel who talks about the moral limits of markets, that when you introduce a market into a space which is a non-market space, it distorts it massively. So, for example, you pay people to give blood rather than seeing it as your civic duty. Far fewer people give blood when you pay people to do it. And actually, the only people who come forward are the drug addicts because they're trying to earn money, and then their blood is useless because you don't want the blood from drug addicts to be in the blood transfusion service, and so on and so forth. And so there has to be a sense of when are we going to recognise that this is a distorting effect that we don't need? When are we going to begin to see that the fashion market is just one aspect of the fashion sector's activity, and all this other stuff is rich and diverse and never gets any attention? I have a great frustration that the language of usership, people don't have the words for it. When I would say to people, so how do you use their things? They'd be like, what do you mean? And then slowly you say, well, and oh yeah. So what we don't even have the words to describe satisfying, ongoing engagement with clothing. But, you know, if I was to ask people how they go shopping, I mean, they would just, you know,
yes, the language
for hours.
So, I mean, underneath all that, it really, what it comes down to is that shift in value from economic growth to a different sort of growth, a more diverse appreciation of different kinds of growth, which I guess leads in now to the whole episode of lockdown and what we've been through, and that potential aperture that many of us have had to kick through. And many of us at that time and now have still been saying, this is the time when change will happen, it has to happen. And we actually saw the actualization of planes and traffic stopping, you know, being reconnected to sounds outside, that very kind of sensory, immediate reconnection to the world, because there wasn't so much white noise going on. And I wondered how you've used that time in particular in relation to your practice as a design activist. Has it shifted a little through that time, and what have you been thinking?
Yeah, it has. Things have shifted. So in the time of lockdown, so lockdown happened, and I, with my long-time collaborator Matilda Tam, we had just sort of launched this piece of work called Earth Logic. And Earth Logic puts forward a radical plan for change for the fashion sector, for industry, for designers, for citizens, for governance, to put Earth first. And effectively what we said was the economic growth logic is the problem. We need a new logic. And so we put forward Earth Logic as a substitute. And when Earth is first and then everything else sort of falls in behind it, it's a remarkable change. So at the beginning of lockdown, we just launched it at London Fashion Week, and we were rolling out a whole series of workshops to push Earth Logic, and then everything just stopped. And for a little while, we were like, oh, you know, what's going to happen next? And then a remarkable thing happened, because we were touring around the UK, including coming to Scotland. We were supposed to be in Glasgow, all cancelled. But then we carried on with these. We moved the workshops online. And then we had an incredible international audience of people that we hadn't imagined would even know about this work. So actually, in a strange sort of way, we went from missing people, face-to-face contact, and what that would have meant in this sort of sense that we have this book and we can share it and bring people on the journey, to this and other, now a sort of global movement around it. So in a strange way, the desire that people had to connect with others really facilitated that work. And also, I think what happened in that time, as you say, people recognized there was a sense that something's got to change here. What will it be? And as they say, that when people are looking around for what's next, they tend to choose an idea that's lying around at the time. I think there was some sort of right-wing economist like Milton Friedman who said that, but it's literally what happens, that people are casting around, what do we do? Oh, here's Earth Logic. And there's a sense that it was fortuitous in that regard. And so that work is continuing to unfold, and we see that it's just got such legs, and it's being really used and picked up in loads of different contexts, with big brands, with governments, with small brands, with whatever. So it's been really effective. And then at the same time, like everybody else who has a teaching schedule, my teaching went like all online and extremely stressful. So then this does this time compression thing and stress, anxiety thing, and then homeschooling because I've got these kids, and then all the responsibilities about how much food can you buy when there's no fat, and what about the blah, blah, blah. And then I was also really attuned to what this incredible world outside, without all of this extraneous human noise, was doing. And so then I started spending so much time within the socially distanced limits and all of that, making more of the work around design in nature, and really coming to a different sort of understanding about the urgency of what we have to do. And I mean, I think it is. I mean, I live in a part of the north of England that has some wild and landscapes that are not everyone's cup of tea. Like, you know, they're quite like scrappy. But in them, I found, I suppose you'd say, like a friendship. And maybe people would sort of go, oh, what's she talking about? But there's such a sense of a total acceptance. In a natural context, and in this world where everything is sort of upside down and changing, this is one of the things that I've found is almost like a powerful platform from which to understand things differently. So I've done that, and I feel like I've done some other things, but I can't remember what they are now. I'm sure I have. I just can't recall.
And yes, of course, that thing of when you reach a crisis point and you reach around. I mean, I feel that there's a real culture of us constantly being in a state of crisis, and being in this, that brings a state of anxiety. And we all know that anxiety makes us less able to think straight and be creative. And yet, in that situation, when we were given the opportunity to stop and think again about how we could do things, and then we find this thing called Zoom, which was there the whole time, very stupid human beings. Then we start to see how it's possible to bring people together without using airplanes. I mean, you do wonder, we are creatures of habit to the point where we become totally blind to obvious potential. Now I was going to look, in the chat box, Karen Finn has said, oh, that'd be a good idea, a libel case against fast fashion companies for fast fashion addiction. That might be a good way to go. Let's bring a case against them.
So like our equivalent of a Mac libel, but yeah.
Now let's see what else. And I guess, yes, during that time, a lot of people, in terms of what Remode was doing, we moved to making up packs and sending them out to people. And it seemed very obvious, and there was a lot of writing going on about, oh, people are making their own food and realizing, oh my God, I love this. It's a much better experience than spending 2 hours in traffic, an hour in the morning, an hour at night, and coming home and slinging something almost inedible into the microwave. You actually cook it. That reconnection became very real. And I wonder if anything is really going to endure beyond this point. What can we do as individuals to make those positive things that we all found endure beyond this point, particularly in relation to clothing?
Yeah, absolutely. Was it just the novelty of it? Was that what it was that we were enticed by? Were those moments of pause? And I think what we've seen from the stats that I've seen, and I haven't looked in depth, I have to say, but it seems like people were buying obsessively in that time, like consumption shifted from high street to online, including for garments that like stretched around the middle because suddenly we're all sedentary. And it's like, okay, so we had these, these moments where we discovered that we really enjoy baking, and maybe we like to do some fancy embroidery. But is that going to spill into the other? Is that going to colour that other established behaviour? And obviously, that's a question it's very,
Hangs in the air. Yeah.
yeah, it's very difficult to answer. I mean, I'm concerned about the class issues that are very often present within all of these sustainability narratives, but never voiced. There's a lot of concern that people, who, I don't know, cheap fast fashion garments are necessary because people are poor, and so it gives access to people to these goods. But I'm really concerned about that as a narrative. Is it only something that the wealthy middle classes can engage in? And of course, it's not only about cost, and so we go back and we suddenly have access to things again. It's about so much more than that. And so there's so many aspects to this, as we build back better, or what on earth they're ever suggesting. And I think it's got to be based in lots of different things. It's about actually some of the things that were really enjoyable in lockdown, included, of course, I'm sure everybody appreciated birdsong. Everybody found their neighbours after not ever really recognising that they had neighbours, and suddenly they had neighbours, and it became pleasant again. If maybe that was a thing, but so there's lots of these things, and I think some of them have to be about what we can do around our personal capabilities, because we were thrown back on our own resources. And I remember thinking, all right, I can't buy anything anymore. I need to make a rubber shim for this thing I was trying to fix. And so I was cutting out a whole hot water bottle trying to make it. And so suddenly it was like we were all in Cuba or something. We were all like, we were all beginning to be the resourceful people.
Imaginative.
Pardon?
Imaginative and resourceful, the kind of stuff that I think we can all do. And it would be lovely to see a whole section of photographs of those kinds of examples you've come up with. What did you do in lockdown? What did you invent to solve a problem? Some would be very funny, but possibly very workable. Yeah, I think we've shown that we can do with a lot less.
Yeah, and I think we've also shown lots of other things. So I think maybe what the COVID crisis has done is it's really revealed the structural inequalities in our society that we need to address. So it's absolutely revealed that. It's also shown us that that governments, that politicians will move fast and can find money even when they claim they can't. So, to all of the questions we've been asking, when they go, oh, no, there's no magic money tree or whatever they call it, and then suddenly, oh, yeah, no, there is. So suddenly we begin to see that things are different to the way that they were before. But I am really bothered by how very easily I've accepted the restrictions to my personal freedoms. I mean, it's suddenly we sort of just accepted it. And then I heard them on the radio the other day saying holidays are illegal. I was like, oh. And of course I knew about the stay-at-home order, but no one had framed it like that. And I thought, gosh, that's something when we understand this is how far we've come. So perhaps, yeah, I mean, it's such an intriguing time.
Yeah.
Fashion and sustainability, it's a time of absolute change. Just one other tiny thing on that. I think that we've probably seen a real sort of, sadly, a hardening where people are going one of two ways. Either people are saying, oh, we can't talk about sustainability now because we've got to take care of the bottom line. So sort of retrenchment. And on the other camp, people are going, now is the time, we need to change.
Yeah.
So there's a real changing up in a really exciting way in that other camp. But I'm afraid it's a sort of, yeah, more of a polarization than we would hope.
Yeah, obviously, I mean, the two things are very much connected, but I think there's been very little conversation around how connected what has happened is with mass consumerism. Anyway, I think we're coming up to past. And before we sign off, I want to tell people about tomorrow evening. If you go on to remoteyouth.org, our website, you will see that we've got a film screening tomorrow night, and it's the sequel, What Will Happen Next in Our Troubled Civilization? And it's a film inspired by the work of David Fleming. And we will have on the panel Kate and Sean Chamberlain, who is an activist and a writer, and a mentee of David Fleming before he passed away a few years ago. I think I'm really looking forward to seeing that film, and afterwards there will be a Zoom room chat. So please get in touch through our website, book a place to come and see the film and take part in the talk. I think that is going to be really interesting. Thank you very much, Kate. It's been really interesting. And I think the big message is that I think there is a lot of hope. Human beings are particularly stupid, that we're also quite clever in other ways. If we can, if we're we seem to be quite good when we're left to our own devices and have to make up answers. I'm going to check the chat box in case there's anything else. Lots of people just saying thank you very much. Lots of food for thought, and thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you to Remote and to Glasgow School of Art, and thank you to everybody for listening, watching.
Watching, yes.
See you tomorrow.
On the screen. Thank you. Bye.